I'm going to be using 3 different brushes for today's project, but you can use any brush that you need to. This is a wide, bright brush. The next is a really old flat brush that has a messed up end on it. And the last is going to be the small round brush. The colors of paint we're going to be using today are red, yellow, burnt sienna, black, ultramarine blue, titanium white, and we're also going to be using phthalo green, but I haven't poured it yet. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to paint an underpainting, which is just painting our entire canvas a solid color. We're going to be using black to do this. The purpose of painting an underpainting is that it changes the tone of all of the colors that you paint on top of it. This painting is generally really dark in the background, so we're just going to go ahead and paint the entire background black. You want a really nice smooth layer because you won't see most of this. And you can go ahead and take this time to paint the sides of your canvas black as well. I'm just using my bright brush as it covers more area. It isn't necessary to dry your canvas after this step. We're going to move on to painting our water now. You're going to take your bright brush and you're going to load a little bit of ultramarine blue paint. And you're going to paint about 3 inches of blue paint from the bottom of your canvas and along the sides as well when you get to the sides. This is going to be a little bit transparent, but that's okay because we want some dark areas in our water. We're going to lighten up some areas, but we need to start getting our first layer on here now. I use the wide side of my brush to move across my canvas horizontally. The direction of your brush will change the impression that you get of your water direction. It's okay if you aren't getting a really rich blue yet because we're going to add another layer, but you have to dry it in between your layers to start getting that color to show through. I'm just smoothing out all of my edges on my water because you really need a sharp, crisp line as you're going across. It is possible to add a masking tape to mask off that line while you're moving to get a really crisp line if you're struggling with it. And if your black paint was still really wet while you're going over it, it might blend in into a really dark navy blue, and that is also alright. I'm only grabbing a little bit of paint at a time while I'm painting because I don't want a lot of really thick paint on these back layers of my painting. I'm using a bright brush for this. It has a square tip because I'm going to be using that for my trees after a while. But you can also use a wide flat brush. But you need to be using a fairly large brush to cover these areas because the acrylic paint will dry really fast and you need to make sure that you're covering your area before your paint dries. We're going to grab a little bit of white on our brush. I'm not going to clean my brush in between. And I'm going to add small areas of white on our water. I'm going to keep most of the light areas towards the center, but I want them to appear fairly random. And I'm going to lightly brush across the blue and it's going to blend in and lighten up some of our blue on our water. You'll get some areas that look like it's moved a little bit too much of the paint off of the canvas, and that's okay because we're going to put another layer on here. So now I've got most of the white off of my brush. I'm going to add a little bit more. I want a light area off to the right side as well, but I don't want it to cover all of the water over there. I just want it to look a little less even on both sides. So now you see that I've lightened up some of the water towards the middle. And I just lightly brush my brush across the water and it just gently blends that in. Once you're done with this layer, you're going to dry it. I've dried my canvas and I'm going to add a second layer to my water. I'm going to repeat the same process by adding this blue color first with my bright brush. Your blue should start looking a little more blue. I'm just going to go over all of my water with this. You're starting to see why we put in that underpainting, because it gives us those nice dark colors. Otherwise we would have had to have put extra layers of blue and added a lot more black in here to get those dark areas, which is still an option if that's something that you would like to do if you ever paint this painting again. I'm just making sure that that line where my water and the rest of my painting meet are extra crisp. It's these little details that really make you believe that the water and the background are meeting together there. Making sure to get the sides of my canvas, because when this is hanging on the wall, you want to make sure that your canvas doesn't have blank sides. And I'm adding a little bit more white to my canvas. And you just want to make sure that you go back and forth. You can use the thin side of your brush if you would rather have thinner areas, but I'm using the thicker side so that I can get these really wide wisps of color. These lighter areas are really starting to define where my reflection is going to go, and we're going to move on to the cliffs before we start drying. I'm moving to a smaller flat brush for this next part, and we're going to be using your phthalo green and your white. So I'm just going to get that phthalo green poured out here on my palette paper real quick. This phthalo green has blue undertones, so it's going to turn into a mint or a light teal looking color once it's mixed with some white. And that's the color we're going to use for our cliffs in the background. You can pre-mix this paint before you use it, but I'm just going to double load most of the time. I'm going to mix it up a little bit so that I can show you what your color is ultimately going to look like. I've grabbed a little bit of white and a little bit of phthalo green, and I'm going to mix it together here on my palette paper so you can see what color we're looking for. And it's this really light mint color. I'm going to take it on my brush and I'm going to mark out where my waterfall is going to be falling in the center. So I'm going to draw a straight line coming up on the right side, which is going to mark the edge of my tall cliff. I'm just going to lightly touch my canvas, and then I'm going to go to the other side, and this is going to mark the edges of my waterfall. And I'm going to come on the top and I'm going to round it over and round up. It's okay if it's not perfect the first time, because you can just add on to it a little bit, but you want it generally pretty close to where you want the edge of your cliff. And these should be rounded and not straight, because the water has fallen on them and eroded some of the edges of them. And to get these little strokes down, you're going to place your brush near that edge that you just put on the top, and you're going to slide your brush down. If you have too much paint on your brush, it's going to be too thick, and you really want it to fade out so that it looks like this moss that's hanging down your rocks. And I slide my brush along the top and then fold it down. If you have too much paint on your brush, just wipe a little bit off on your palette or on a paper towel and come back to it. You can switch to the narrow side of your brush and come down if you're struggling to get it as well. I'm just trying to smooth out all of the strokes that are coming down because I don't want them looking really choppy. You should always be starting near where the top of your cliff is. And you don't want these even when they come down. You want them to all end in slightly different areas so that it looks more natural. So you want to imagine that the water has been falling on these cliffs for a really long time and has been starting to grow moss. And I have it this mint color because I initially had planned on it looking like another planet, and they have teal moss, so it could be like bioluminescent moss that's growing on the rocks. So it's just one of those things where your paintings don't have to be realistic, but they can have realistic qualities in them. But I just wanted to make them look like they really were bright and shiny because I really like this mint color. And I'm just doing the same thing on the other side. I'm smoothing my brush along the top of the cliff and then bringing it down. as it gets closer to the center of your cliff, you're going to want to make sure that it's more narrow coming down, because the moss there doesn't touch the waterfall as much, so it's a lot thinner. If this gets too dark, just put a little bit of white on your brush and go back over it in white. And if it gets too light, you can do the same by just putting green on your brush and going back over it in just the green. It's okay if it's a little too see-through or a little choppy looking the first time, because we're gonna go back over it again. So I'm just gonna come back over to this first one I did, and I'm going to do the same thing and come back over it. And you can lighten it up or darken it up, but I really just mostly want to smooth out my moss so it doesn't look so choppy. It's okay if you start to lose your smooth edge a little bit, but try to make it as smooth as possible, because you can come back with black in a little bit and smooth it out if you need to. I'm grabbing the sides of my canvas so that it doesn't look like it stops there. And we want to make sure that this cliff is completely done before we move on to the smaller cliffs below it, because they sit behind it and it's easier to get it before you move on to things that are in front of it. Usually with paintings, you want to try and start with the backgrounds as often as possible before you move forward, just because it's easier that way. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about this brush that I'm using. This is a really old brush that I have. I've used it so much and for so many different things that it's lost the flat edge that it had on it. It used to be really nice and crisp on the edge. I don't need it to be that way for this painting, and I chose it because I'm going to be using it to make the bushes in my painting. It works pretty flat for something like this because I don't need a really flat edge. But for the bushes, I'm going to be tapping it onto my canvas, and if you're using a new brush, it's going to mess up the tip of your brush, and I don't want to mess up any of my new brushes. So it has a really nice wide tip on it with bristles that aren't all in the same place. You can buy brushes that are specifically meant for doing that technique, but I'm just using an old brush. We're going to go ahead and add some of our smaller cliffs now. So I'm going to add some more of that phthalo green and white on my brush, and we're going to paint in our smaller cliffs. So I'm going to come just below our cliff of above, and this one is going to just be shorter, but it's the same idea. So you have these small rounded areas that work their way up, and you're just flicking them down. You don't want the moss to come all the way down to the water. It won't hurt anything if it does. A lot of these are going to be covered up by our bushes. So you might end up with some areas that look like they're getting a little bit too thick and filled in. That's okay, because we can adjust that a little bit once it dries by adding a little bit of black. So I'm going to leave the one alone because it looks like it got a little too filled in, and I'm just going to come over to the other side and do the same thing. The centers of your cliffs don't have to be perfect because we can cover them up with a waterfall a little bit. Once you're done with this, you want to go ahead and clean out your brush, and we're going to add some brighter areas to the reflection on our water. We're going to use the same brush, but we're just going to be using the white. So you want to grab just a little tiny bit of white on the tip of your brush. I want to wipe off any extra because I definitely don't want too much doing this. And I'm going to be using the narrow side of my brush, and starting where my water and my background meet, I'm going to very, very, very lightly add some little wisps of white paint. I want to be very careful that my paint doesn't go in a straight line down my water, and I want it to loosely zigzag across my canvas. And these don't even all have to touch each other. I just need to lighten up some little areas. I'm going to add this little white spot over here off to the right because it's going to be right under a tree. I want these light areas on here so when we add color, it's really bright when we add our color into our reflection. Now that I have that in there while it's drying, I'm going to go back and add a second layer of color onto our small cliffs. I'm going to grab some phthalo green and some white again on my brush, and I'm going to add the second layer. If this is where you need to add a little bit of black coming from the bottom and flicking up, you can, but sometimes it's best to leave things alone before you mess with them too much. So I'm not going to add any black to these. I'm just going to smooth out the color that I already have. If you have any areas that look like they got too thick, you can just use a little bit of color to try and streak it out a little bit. Again, you don't want these to look like they end in a straight line. So I gradually lift my brush up a little bit as I get towards the end so that it doesn't end on a straight line. It looks like it has an uneven edge. If you struggle with this because your brush is a little bit too straight on the edge, you can turn it sideways and use the narrow end to get those straight areas where it looks like the moss is growing down your cliff. Once you're done coloring your cliffs, you're going to clean out your brush and we're going to start putting in our waterfall. You're going to use the same brush, but we need to change our colors. We're going to be using the ultramarine blue and the white for our waterfall. And again, we're going to be double loading our brush. This first time I get a little bit too much of that phthalo green in it and I need to start over. I'm just going to clean out my brush again and grab from the side and grab a little bit more blue. And I'm using the narrow side of my brush to start. I'm starting from the top of my canvas and I'm working my way down through that gap that we made between our cliffs. And you don't want to over blend your paint because you want it to look like there's dark areas and white areas where your water is falling. So I'm just lightly stroking down my waterfall, and I want my waterfall to just hit the top cliffs that I have on the sides because we're going to make it splash there. And I'm going to run it along the sides of the center because if you imagine water coming down and eroding this cliff, it's eroded all of the sides of these tall cliffs and it's still working on these bottom cliffs. So it's just going to slightly hit those bottom cliffs and we're going to splash it there too, and it's going to splash into the water in the bottom of our little pond. And you can add more blue and more white, but we're just going to fill all of this area in, and your waterfall can be a little bit wider on top and it can narrow down as it gets lower. It's okay if it messes up your straight line that you had where your water and your background meet because we're going to put a splashy area there too. I'm just going to get the top of my canvas. I'm going to keep on adding color, and I switch back and forth between using the narrow and the wide side of my brush to get the effect that I want my waterfall to have. I want it to look natural, but I also want it to have bits of dark color and light color in it. Or even if you want some of the black background to show through from the black cliffs behind it, you can do that as well. And this can be done in 2 layers as well. If it starts to overblend, I recommend stopping and making sure that it's dry before you add any more. By adding the white instead of just the blue, it makes the water look like it has a lot more movement, And typically whenever you have a lot of white in water, it gives the appearance that it's not really smooth and clear. It's more choppy and fast moving. And that's the impression that I want with the waterfall. It's not a really smooth waterfall. It's moving really fast down this cliff. We're now going to dry our painting once we're done with this layer, and we're going to add a second layer to our waterfall. I'm cleaning out my brush to start fresh over again. I'm still going to use the same colors, the ultramarine blue and the white, but I want to add a lot more darker areas this time because my waterfall started to get really light. So I'm just coming in first with a lot of this ultramarine blue and adding some more darker areas to my waterfall. Sorry, the camera got a little unfocused during this part, but you get the idea. I just want it to look natural and uneven. This is not something we're going to come back to again, so you want to make sure that it's good this time. If you overblend it again, don't worry, you can just pause this video, dry it, and start all over again. I'm adding some areas that have a little bit more white, so it appears like the water is rushing a little bit faster in those areas, especially where it's going to hit my cliff. My paint is starting to blend a lot, so I'm just about finished with adding the second layer on here. Once you're done with your waterfall, you're going to make sure you clean out your brush really, really well. And you're going to grab a little tiny bit of yellow on your brush. Make sure that it's not very much. And we're going to go over that highlight that we added to our water for our reflection. And we're just going to lightly brush in some yellow. You don't want to make it too rich. We're just trying to add a little bit of color to our water. These are eventually going to be the reflections. We're going to grab red without rinsing on our brush, and we're going to add that right on top of that yellow. We want it to be more orange than it is yellow and more orange than red, so we're just going to brush that red right on top of that yellow, and we're going to start getting some oranges that come out with those colors mixing. So you need to make sure that you're doing this while your painting is still wet. You can come back and add some yellow on top of that red if it's not looking orange enough. You can go over your lighter areas into that darker area if you want, and you'll start to see a little bit of that color pop there as well. And I want you to just move back and forth with this red and yellow and add color to that light area in your water. You don't want to overblend these colors either. You want to make sure that you have streaks of both. You can grab a little bit of white and mix it in there, and you'll start lightening up some of those colors, and you'll get some light oranges and some light yellows and pinks. I'm just using the very, very tip of my brush to lightly brush across my canvas using the narrow side. I barely touch my canvas while doing this part because I don't want anything to be too solid of one color. After you're done adding these color reflections, you're going to clean out your brush, and we're going to add some of the splashes where our waterfall is hitting our cliffs. So you're going to grab a little tiny bit of white on the corner of your brush. You want to make sure that there's barely any on there at all. Make sure you tap off any extra paint if there is too much. And you're just going to take the corner of that brush and you're going to tap it on the corner of your cliff where your waterfall meets it. And you want to make sure that it looks natural. So if it's too thick of paint, you need to make sure that you get a lot of it off your brush immediately. And I'm just tapping around so it looks like the water is splashed. And I'm just using the corner of my brush, and this is why I used an old brush that has a tip that is not straight anymore. And the splashes don't all touch each other because the splashes of water kind of get smaller as they blow away from the main source of where it's hitting. This is something that does take practice. We're also going to add it to the bottom where our waterfall meets the pond that it's hitting, and where our waterfall hits our small little cliffs. So it goes over the cliff just a little bit, but not so much that it loses the shape of the cliff. And I'm making sure that I add enough splashes that it goes off to the sides a little bit and it looks like it naturally gets smaller. And on where it hits the pond, it's going to get smaller as it works its way outwards, and it's a lot bigger as it's towards the center. Your pond might still have some wet paint and it might pick up some of that, but that's okay because your splash from your waterfall might be picking up some of the reflections from your trees as well. So you notice that the bottom of my splash is picking up a little bit of that red and yellow, and I'm okay with that because the water's probably still reflecting some of the colors from our bushes we're going to add. I'm just going in and making this look as natural as possible, and I'm also going to come in here in a minute and I'm going to add a little bit more. And I'm trying to make it look like it naturally gets smaller as it goes away from the waterfall. Now that you've got your water splash in, we're going to be cleaning out our brush, and we're going to add a little bit more color to the reflections on our water. Your painting should now start to look like it's coming together. So we're going to add a little bit of yellow on our brush again, and we're going to come back to our water and just start tapping in some more of that color. And remember to go in the direction of your water from left to right. When you first start painting, you might start adding some of those wiggly lines that move down your water to look like your water is moving, but your water is actually moving from side to side and not towards you. The way that we're making a reflection move towards us in a zigzag line still gives you that impression that your water is moving towards you. And you'll see that I still have a lot of separated reds and white and yellows and oranges, because these are all going to be leaves coming off of our trees. They can also be piles of leaves that have fallen into the water. You're going to clean out your brush again, and we're going to grab a little bit of white, and we're going to add a colored area in the bottom corner of our painting. This is something like a bush. My husband says it looks like fire, but I got the idea from a burning bush, but the leaves look like they're kind of blowing, and that's where I got the idea for the leaves and the reflection in the water, that some of the leaves have blown off of the trees. So we're just adding this light color down here because I want this to be really bright and in the foreground of our painting. So I'm trying to lighten up the painting a little bit before we add the yellows and reds to it. I'm using the side of my brush, and I'm starting from the left-hand side, and I'm making a curved line that swoops up and comes down and comes back up. And my brush gets lighter on the canvas as it comes towards the end of it, so it comes out into a nice tip. It does not have to be perfect, we're just lightening up the area. Once you've got that in, you can go ahead and clean out your brush. Now I'm going to take my brush and I'm going to grab some of that white paint again, just a little bit on the corner of my brush, and I'm going to tap it onto the splash on our waterfall. I want this to look a little bit more opaque than what I already put on there, but not in all of the areas. This is just going to give our splash a little bit of depth. And I'm going to just extend it out a little bit and make sure that everything looks very natural and not uniform. It's really important to make sure that you don't have too much paint on your brush while you're doing this. And this is going to cover up some of that color if you left a little bit of color from your reflections in the water, if you didn't like the way that it looked while it was in your splash. Make sure that your splash doesn't come too far into your pond, but it can come out a little ways. These kinds of things that you're going to do in your paintings make it really nice to keep some of those old brushes that get kind of gnarly on the ends, because you can do these fun things with them. I have a brush that I also like to use for something like this that's called a deer foot. Sometimes you'll see a million different kinds of brushes at the store, and it seems like they're always adding new ones. I like to add to my brush collection every once in a while, but you can always make all the brushes you have at home work We're going to add in our tree branches next, so we're going to switch to our round brush. We're going to grab some of that burnt sienna paint. We're going to come to the left side, and just above that bush that we're adding, you're going to use the tippy toes of your brush and you're going to add a stick that comes at a diagonal. And I'm just going to thicken it out just a little bit to make sure that I don't lose it because it's on top of that black paint. And we're going to add a little Y onto the branch after we get it all filled in. And we want these to come into our waterfall area a little bit so that it starts adding some depth to our painting. I'm just filling it in a little bit more to make sure that it's nice and filled in and opaque. And I'm going to make my first Y coming towards the end of it and going up. But if that doesn't look natural for your branch, you can place it somewhere else on your branch. Just remember that your branches typically grow outward and not backwards. I'm gonna add another one. Mine is closer to the edge of my canvas, but I want you to do whatever looks more natural for the little branch on yours. I'm gonna add another Y on this branch. You can just keep on going over your branches until they're all filled in. If they're still a little bit transparent, that's okay because we're gonna add a little white here in a minute. I'm going to come to the other side and I'm going to add another branch on this side. So I'm going to come out the opposite direction, but still come in at the same angle. And I'm going to add my little Y branches on here. You can add yours in the same place as mine, but you don't have to, just whatever looks more natural in your painting. And I don't get my branches too low because I'm going to add some little bushy leaves to them, and I don't want those sitting too close to the water. And you want your branches to get a little bit thinner as they get towards the end. So what I do is I start with my brush laying a little bit more flat, and I start to slowly let up the pressure on my brush so that it gets thinner at the tip. You're going to clean some of that brown off your brush, and we're going to dip it in a little tiny bit of white, and we're going to add that to the tops of our branches. Your paint should still be wet, so it's going to blend in just a little bit. At first it looks really white, but I'm just getting some of the white paint off of my brush so that I can go back and just slightly blend it in. This is going to make your branches a little more opaque and look like they have a little bit of light shining on the tops of them. If they get too white, you can just grab a little bit of brown and add that back in. You don't want white branches. You don't want to add this to both sides of your branches. You're only adding it to the side that you think would have a little bit of light shining on it. This will also make your tree branches look like they're more rounded and a little less flat, and they stand out from your background a lot better. If you make any mistakes with these, just remember you can let it dry and you can start over once your paint is dry. Here I thought it would look better if I added another branch, so I'm just adding that now. And my branches got a little thick, and all you need to do to fix that is go back to where that branch started and thicken it out as it goes down to the main part of the branch. So here I'm just thickening out my branch with a little bit more brown paint. You can go over your tree as many times as you need to, just don't forget to grab your white and go back over and add your highlights back in. You can get creative with some of your branches looking like they're in front of each other by extending your highlight past the branch before it. Once that branch looks the way that you want it, you're going to move to the other side and you're going to add the highlight on this branch. Your light source should be coming from up above, so your highlights are going to also be on top of your branches. I'm imagining that there's a moon lighting our waterfall. Most of the paintings that we do are going to have one thing that is particularly difficult, and for this one it's going to be the leaves on our trees. We're going to start out by grabbing some red on our brush, not very much, and you're going to go to where your branches end and you're going to tap it around the ends of your branches. You're going to imagine that there's little groups of leaves and you're only going to be painting the bottom of those groups red. So I'm just going to go around and imagine that there's balls of leaves, and I've added these two red ones, and I'm adding the bottom of this little bunch right here. The difficult part with this is that you're going to rework these over and over until they look the right way. Some of these we're going to add in and imagine that there were branches growing out to grow these little bunches. You'll do the same on the other side. You just want to make sure that you get the ends of your branches. You can get a little creative with adding groups that are in the middle of your branches, and these can go off of your canvas a little bit. Your red is going to dry a little bit more transparent than it looks right now, so don't worry that it gets dark as it dries. You need to work quickly while your paint is still wet, so without cleaning your brush, you're going to grab a little bit of yellow on the end of your brush and you're going to tap where the red on the top ends. So just along the tops of these little groups, I'm tapping this yellow into the top and it's going to turn the middle of our little bunches orange. You're going to do this for all of them. If you get too much paint on your brush, you're going to want to just completely clean out your brush and start grabbing yellow on a clean brush. Your paint should be wet still where your red is, so it's going to keep on blending. Both of these are going to be a little transparent right now, and that's okay. You just have to keep working while it's all wet. And this will get brighter as we keep working. You just want that nice orange. The order that you do your little bush ends in is going to matter at the end, but right now you're just trying to get those colors in. Generally, the ones that you do first are going to be behind the ones that you layer on top of them. Right now, I'm not too concerned about it as I am just getting in these layers of color. I'm getting a lot of paint on my brush, so I'm going to have to clean it off here in a second. So I'm just tapping off some extra paint on my palette paper for right now. And I'm going to grab some white and I'm just tapping it in the tops of my bushes. And this is really going to brighten up those little bunches of leaves that I'm putting on my bushes. It's extra bright right now, but I'm not too concerned about it as I'm just trying to get some of that color in these little groups. And I keep on wiping off some extra paint because I don't want too much while I'm doing this. I'm just tapping this like I did on the splashes from our waterfall, but I'm tapping it on the color that was right below it and it's mixing into it. So now you're getting this really light orangey yellow. I'm gonna do that with the other side as well. This side is already starting to dry, so it's a little bit more white. That's okay right now, but we'll eventually want it to be more orange yellow when we get there. But this is going to look like the light is shining on top of our bushes and is really bringing out the color of the leaves. And these are imaginary trees, but I like to imagine that they had fall colors. So reds and oranges and some dark yellows. So I'm cleaning out some of the paint on my brush because it was getting too painty to keep on mixing together with these. And I'm going to go back and add some yellow to my little bush while I'm waiting for the other the paint on our leaves to dry up a little bit. The bush kind of requires just layering up colors and letting them dry and come back. We're going to add a little bit of red on it because we want some of those oranges to come in. The bushes also matter with the order that you put your little wispy leaves in. If you start towards the edge of your brush, bush and then work your way to the corner, it will lay them in the way that they should be layered. The edges, I kind of just paint because you can't really see the ends of them, so it doesn't really matter, but I want to make sure that I get that orange and red and yellow on the edge of my canvas as well. I'm going to throw a little white in there just to bring out some lighter colors in those. And just like with the other things in this painting, the more you overwork it, the more blended all of your paint becomes and you can't really see the difference. So just be careful to not overwork it and stop. And you can come back and layer it once it dries. So I'm going to clean up my brush again. And I'm going to grab some red paint and I'm going to go back to my bush real quick just to add a couple darker layers before I move on. And you can see that all of my paints are starting to blend a little bit, but you can still see quite a bit of definition. Right now my painting is very wet, so I need to let it dry or dry it manually before I can move on. All right, we're back. We're gonna take this same little flat brush and we are going to go back and add some more layers onto our bushes. So we're gonna grab some red paint, not too much. You're gonna go to the bottom of your little bunches of leaves and you're going to do the same thing. You're just gonna add some red paint. You're going to want to start paying more attention to the order that you want to paint these in and which ones you want to lay in front of each other. I don't like them all laying in front of each other from top to bottom. I like sometimes maybe the ones in the middle that lay in front of the other ones. So I'm going to go back and forth through a lot of this and I'm going to change up which ones I want to be in front of each other. This red is going to start drying a little bit brighter than it did on the first layer. I missed one of the top bunches on the left side, but I'm going to get back to it. And this one, I'm even extending some of my leaves a little bit further than I did last time. That's okay, because you don't need these to be perfect little balls of color. And they don't even have to all be touching each other. You just have to imply that they're leaves. Painting is all about finding the closest you can get to something without it not looking like a tree or water. And trees are one of those things where you can really get someone to believe that it's a tree without painting every single leaf and every single branch. So I'm getting too much paint on my brush, so I constantly have to keep on dabbing some extra off. Otherwise I just get a bunch of gloopy paint on my trees. And still I'm taking this yellow and I'm dabbing it where the red meets to get that really nice like that fall-y orange color. And if they start to round out too much, just extend them a little bit. We started with them pretty small, so you have a little bit of wiggle room to branch out your leaves. It's okay if some of these are a little transparent, because if you were looking at a tree in real life, it's very possible that you could still see the branches beyond the leaves. So here I'm just going in back and grabbing that one that I missed. My little bunches aren't getting too bright yet. They're staying pretty muted. My little bunches get a lot more bright on the right hand side, and that's okay. It's probably because I had a lot more white paint on the last round of paint. It's possible that they were maybe just getting a little more light than the other side. And you could always go back and do this painting with green leaves instead of these fall colors. I just think that this red and yellow really pop with this background. I'm cleaning out my brush again because it gets a lot of paint on it really quickly. I'm gonna grab that white and be extra careful, and I'm gonna add that bright area right on top of each one of these little bunches. And if you want these to end up being a little more yellow than this really light orange that I get, you can add some yellow into that white paint while you're putting it on it, and it'll make it a little more yellow. They don't have to be real trees, so you can have bright yellow leaves on them. But that lightness that you add to the top really makes them not blend in together. And there I got a little bit too much white paint on my brush when I went to put it on. So I'm moving that white paint around to the other little bunches, and then I'll go back and work that one that had too much white paint on into it. And some of these might look like they don't blend very well. I'm going to go back with some red paint and blend them back in. A lot of these is just working back and forth. This is why this is the hardest part of this painting, is that it's just a lot of back and forth until these look like they blend in together and they look natural and not like balls of color on the ends of your branches, unless that's what you want. They look a little Dr. Seuss-y. You can go back over these trees as many times as you need to. You might just have to dry your painting in between going over them if your paint starts to blend in together a little bit too much. So you'll notice that you can grab some red paint and you can go right back underneath some of these. Sometimes you have to clean off your brush first, but you can grab that red paint and go right underneath that light color that you added and try to blend it back in a little bit. If the bunch is behind another bunch of leaves, you'll just want to be careful to make sure that all of the color of that one stays behind the other one. Here I thought that maybe I'd try and just bring it in front of that other bunch, but I don't really like it, so I'm going to stick it in the back again. I just have to wait for the paint to dry a little bit and jump around. Here I'm sticking with the same tree for a little while, because I want to work with it while the paint is still really wet so that I can get it to blend in really well before I move on to the next tree. Once it starts to get so wet that I can't work with it anymore, I'll move on to the other tree. So here my red got really small while I was working on the top, so I'm just adding some more red in. You won't be able to get the red any darker once you start mixing these colors together, so you just kind of have to move on and come back if you want to darken it up. And that's what I'm doing down here. This bottom one down here has completely dried, so I'm just adding some more red and yellow. And there, the orange is a lot darker, so I'm going to grab some more light paint after I've cleaned out my brush and get some of that paint off of there. And this one's going to have more of a yellow top. And the more you work these, the more blended you'll start to see them. They just take a little finessing. You want to make sure while you're working on these that you never have too much paint on your brush, because it's really hard to blend your paints when there's too much on your canvas. I really like using the palette paper for doing that, because it's a lot easier than working from little cups in one of those plastic palettes and just getting little bits of paint at a time, or even mixing colors. I usually use a glass plate, but for this, the colors really showed up really well on the palette paper. Normally this is where I would speed up a painting, but I thought that it would be a little more valuable to show you how long it actually takes to work these little bush groups over and over again to really get the right color, and to see how I do it in case you need to keep on working on it. What you don't want to have is to have really solid definitions between your color changes. So you'll notice the one that's next to this one still has that, where the red and the orange have a really solid line that need blended out. But it's in front of the other one, so I'm not too worried about getting it before these ones that are behind it. I'm still using the corner of this brush because it gives a little bit more of a chunky texture to it whenever I tap it. If you have a round brush that has a really wide end on it from smashing it on a canvas or whatever, you can also use something like that. But I find that the round brushes have more flimsy bristles and don't really tap into the canvas as well as some of these flat brushes do. And I am almost done with this little group of trees on the left-hand side. We're all finished with the tree on the left-hand side, so I'm going to grab some yellow on my brush and I'm going to add a little bit of color to the bush. I'm done with most of the color for the bush now. I'm just adding little bits that will stand out and not blend in with the others, and it's really important that I get some of these bright yellows in there. I like to work around my painting while it's drying, so that I don't have to take time out of painting to dry it manually. If you add a little bit of white to your yellow, it really brightens up the yellow and makes it more opaque. I'm just cleaning off my brush because I'm ready to move back onto my tree. We've cleaned out our brush. We're going to grab some red paint and we're going to go right in just like we did with the left-hand side and just like we did with the side before. So I'm grabbing a little bit of red paint on my brush. I'm tapping the bottom of each one of the little segments. You're probably getting the idea by now. And just a reminder, by now you're going to want to really have an idea of which brush or which bush is going to be in front of the other one. And like I've said before, I don't really like all of my little tree branches to be on top of each other going from bottom to top. I like the ones around the middle to kind of stand out. Whenever I imagine a tree, I imagine that the way that it grows is it is a little bit more narrow towards the bottom, more bushy in the middle, and narrows at the top. And that's how I think of whenever I build out my trees and bushes. If you go over the top with the yellow a little bit, it's going to be really see-through with that black background, so you are going to have to add a little extra white so that it covers over that black. I'm really loving how these bushes are looking with this really awesome highlight on top of them. We've also covered up a lot of those little rocks that we had in the background at the bottom of our cliff. So a lot of your little imperfections are probably hidden if you had any in your small cliffs. So I'm just going to stop talking here while I finish up going back and forth with these little tree bunches, and I will talk some more once I am all finished with these trees. that's all that there is to the tree, so I'm going to clean out my brush, grab a little bit of red, and put it in this bush that I have here in the left-hand corner to brighten out some of that red. A lot of my paint blended into just an orange. Grab some more yellow, and these are just the final touches that I'm putting on the bush. Try not to overthink it, but you do want to have little bright areas and some of those dark red areas to contrast with each other. Remember, you want to start towards the end of the bush and work your way towards the corner so that they layer on top of each other in the right direction. It's important right now because this is the last time you'll go over this bush. The bush doesn't quite have enough detail and have enough contrast between the colors, so I'm going to jump over to this round brush and grab some color and just add some smaller strokes of color in there, just to break up some of those big chunks of color. It's okay at this point if you mix any of your reds and yellows and whites and just play around with those oranges and getting out some different colors, because we're all done with all of those colors. So you can just have some fun with adding a little bit. And that is all there is to this painting. I hope you enjoyed painting this beautiful waterfall with me today, and I will catch you in the next one.